It's autumn 1642. In a bid to win a quick victory against parliamentarian rebels, King Charles of England has raised a large army and marches on London. As his troops pass the village of Kyneton late on October the 22nd, an even larger parliamentarian force catches up to them. Despite this, he feels confident, and the king forms his men up on top of the Edgehill Ridge and prepares to give battle. After months of preparation, the king and his parliament now prepare to face off in open battle. The English Civil War has begun. The events that led the king and parliament to wage civil war against each other began years earlier. An ill-thought-out attempt by the king to force the Scottish church to be more like the English one led to rebellion and humiliation. In 1640, Scottish troops marched into England and occupied much of Northumberland and County Durham in a deeply embarrassing defeat for the king. Almost bankrupt, Charles was forced to call Parliament for the first time in over a decade to plead for money. Seizing on the king's weakness, a group of hardline MPs moved to severely curtail the crown's power and enhance Parliament's role in government. Over a year of arguments between the king and Parliament followed until in January 1642, Charles decided that he'd had enough. Storming into the Commons chamber with 300 armed men, he attempted to arrest 5 leading parliamentarians but found them conveniently absent. To his fury, the Speaker then refused to reveal their location, asserting that he was a servant of Parliament and not the king. This attempted coup by the king provoked mass public unrest in London and led to Charles fleeing the capital, fracturing the nation's government geographically. Setting up his court at York, Charles moved to consolidate a power base that could act in opposition to Parliament, even as he continued to work with them on some issues. Attempts to broker a compromise between the king and Parliament on the key issues persisted through the first half of 1642, but the king's rejection of Parliament's 19 propositions in June made a violent solution to the crisis inevitable. Both sides began to mobilise supporters across the country, attempting to seize valuable military resources for their side. Most important were 3 huge arms depots at Hull, London and the naval base at Portsmouth. Hull and London were held securely by parliamentarian garrisons, so it was significant when, in early August, Portsmouth declared for the Royalists. Parliament wasted little time in dispatching an army to lay siege to the city, determined to keep as many arms as possible out of Royalist hands. Elsewhere in the country, an embryonic civil war was beginning to take shape. In Somerset, a Royalist force was besieged in Sherborne through August, but managed to repel a disorganised parliamentarian army, while in Warwickshire it was the Royalists who proved ineffective. They attempted a siege of Warwick before retreating north and stumbling into a large parliamentarian force near the village of Southam. Meanwhile, by mid-August the king had moved to Nottingham, attempting to gather more supporters as he went. On August the 11th he raised his royal standard in an effective declaration of war on Parliament. Though an important moment, it did not result in an immediate march on London, not least because the king was badly lagging behind Parliament in terms of both men and supplies. The Royalists' problems were compounded when on September the 7th, Portsmouth fell to its besiegers, delivering even more weaponry to the parliamentarian side. Desperate to secure more support, Charles left Nottingham on September the 13th and headed for Shrewsbury in the Severn Valley. 6 days later, the parliamentarian main force, with the Earl of Essex again in command, marched for Worcester, aiming to keep in touch with the king's movements. As Essex's army approached their destination, he pushed a vanguard of cavalry ahead of his main force to secure the town as quickly as possible. As they rushed across the River Teme at Powick Bridge, they found a royalist force led by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, positioned on the opposite bank. In a brief battle, the superior royalist cavalry were easily able to throw the enemy back across the river, in a morale-boosting victory for the Cavaliers. Despite this success though, Prince Rupert knew he could not hold Worcester against Essex's main force, so quickly fell back to Tewkesbury. Both sides now hesitated, as the parliamentarians licked their wounds and the royalists considered the hilly terrain around Worcester unsuitable for their powerful cavalry forces. Eventually, in mid-October, the king decided to attempt to bait Essex into engaging him on more favourable ground, and began to march directly for London. He stole 3 days' march on the Parliamentarians, and before they could leave Worcester, the king's troops were already at Meriden Heath in Oxfordshire. Playing catch-up, Essex gambled, guessing correctly that the king would now advance towards Oxford through the town of Banbury. Late on October the 22nd, the Parliamentarians finally caught up to the Royalists. Viewing the terrain between the two armies to be favourable to cavalry charges, Charles opted to give battle the following day. Of the two armies, the Parliamentarians had more men, with 15,000 troops compared to about 14,000 for the Royalists. To compound this, Essex could call on thousands of other troops which were rushing to reinforce him, while the Royalist army was the sum total of its troops in the area. This meant that the Parliamentarians were happy to wait through the morning and put the impetus on the Royalists to make the first move. In the early afternoon, the Royalists moved off the ridge and came down onto the flat plain below. They began to take up positions about a mile southeast of the Parliamentarians, near to the village of Radway. As for the Parliamentarians themselves, they awaited the Royalist advance atop a small ridge in the centre of the plain, having advanced some way past the village of Kyneton, where most of their supplies now were. Aware of the superiority of the Royalist cavalry, Essex ordered groups of musketmen out onto the flanks to try and reduce the effectiveness of the Royalist cavalry. The vast majority of the cavalry itself for the Parliamentarians was massed on the left flank to counter the stronger Royalist right under the command of Prince Rupert. All told, the length of the two battle lines was about 2 miles. After a relatively ineffective artillery exchange between the two sides, the Royalists made the first moves, dispatching dragoons to clear out the Parliamentarian musketmen from the hedges and ditches they had taken earlier that day. After a relatively short period of time, the Royalists managed to dislodge their enemies enough to allow a proper cavalry charge, and on both flanks the Royalist forward line of cavalry now charged for their opposite numbers. Foolishly, the Parliamentarian left under Sir James Ramsay chose to remain stationary rather than countercharge, and Prince Rupert's men tore through their ranks. As at Powick Bridge, the Royalist cavalry was superior, and this soon told. On both flanks, the main body of the Parliamentarian horse was quickly put to flight, making a disorganised retreat towards Kyneton, pursued by almost all the Royalist cavalry. To the king's frustration, even the cavalry reserves under Sir John Byron, thinking the battle was all but won, jubilantly charged after the fleeing Parliamentarians, basically removing themselves from the field of battle. Despite this, the situation still looked rosy for the king's troops. Some detachments of cavalry did turn and smash into the nearest brigade of Parliamentarian infantry, and after seeing their protective cavalry turn and run, this brigade under Charles Essex began to do likewise. Panic spread through the ranks, and the entire Parliamentarian left began to crumble. Had Prince Rupert's men been present to exploit this, a decisive Royalist victory could have been achieved. As it was, most of the Royalist cavalry was now looting the Parliamentarian baggage train, allowing their enemies to rush their reserve brigade forward to fill the gaps and galvanise their comrades. Fierce melee combat was now breaking out across the battlefield as the main forces engaged. The Royalists likely had more men in the fight at this stage, but crucially they didn't have any real cavalry support present on the battlefield. Despite their mauling, the Parliamentarians did have a small group under Sir William Balfour left, and they used them to devastating effect. Repeated charges against the Royalist lines pushed them back, and units on the Royalist left began to break. Seeing a gap in the lines, Balfour's men charged through, managing to get behind the Royalist army and raid their artillery before being forced to retreat. By this stage, over 3 hours of combat had passed, and the sun was beginning to set. No clear winner had emerged, though it was the King's army now on the back foot. Slowly the Royalists disengaged and pulled back onto the slope of Edgehill. Returning Royalist cavalry strengthened their position and made attacks by their opponents almost impossible. As darkness fell, both armies struggled to reorganise themselves. Through the night the Parliamentarians were reinforced, and by dawn were clearly the stronger of the two armies. However, The Royalists had now resumed their position on top of the Edgehill Ridge, and Essex decided that an attack would be foolish. Both sides attempted to claim victory at Edgehill, though in truth it was inconclusive. Neither side managed to deliver the killing blow. Had either side been able to decisively defeat the other, it's very possible that the Civil War might have ended before it had really begun. That's what makes Edgehill important. Its inconclusive nature meant that the Civil War would drag on for 4 long years, affecting the lives of every person in Britain. Far from settling things, Edgehill was just the beginning.